The cursor moved on its own, darting across the screen like a ghost in the machine. Marjorie watched, frozen, as the financial files she'd protected for 30 years began to vanish into a digital void, one folder at a time. The hum of the library's basement archive felt like a death rattle as the Grant Allocation folder flickered and died. With a trembling hand, she lunged for the print button, the mechanical scream of the old printer the only sound against the suffocating silence of the empty building. Outside, the headlights of a black sedan cut through the Philadelphia fog, idling at the curb with a patient, predatory stillness. Marjorie clutched the warm, ink-smelling pages to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent a lifetime teaching children that stories have heroes and villains. But as the heavy oak doors locked behind her and a shadow detached itself from the alleyway, she realized she was no longer reading a story. She was being erased from one. The bell above the door chimed once, sharp and brittle, as Marjorie Quinn stepped inside the library. The air hit her first, thick with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and the damp heat of the radiator, a smell that had defined the geography of her life for 30 years. She exhaled through her nose, the sound lost beneath the high, vaulted ceilings where shadows clung to the oak beams like silent witnesses. Marjorie moved with a measured pace, her fingers trailing along the spines of the books. Weathered leather, frayed buckram, and embossed linen. Each texture was a familiar map beneath her skin. She reached the registration desk, a massive slab of dark oak with a brass plate dated 1902. Her hands, long and thin with knuckles white from years of gripping ledgers, moved methodically to set down her bag. She adjusted her glasses, the thin metal frames cool against the bridge of her nose, and looked out over the reading room. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting amber and violet patches onto the red-tiled floor. It was a cathedral of silence, a place where time didn't so much pass as accumulate. Marjorie picked up her heavy ceramic mug, the one with the small chip on the handle she'd refused to discard for a decade. The steam from the coffee rose in a bitter, comforting plume. She watched the dust motes dance in the light, feeling the quiet pulse of the building. This was the order she had built, the balance she maintained. Every book in its place, every debt accounted for. She began her morning rounds, pausing to straighten a volume of Tennyson that had tilted an inch to the left. The coolness of the cover seeped into her palm. She believed in this order. She believed that if the books were straight and the records were clear, the world outside, the world that had swallowed her sister in a haze of poverty and neglect, could be kept at bay. The quiet was interrupted by the heavy thud of the oak chairs being moved. Marjorie began setting them in a semicircle on the faded Persian rug in the children's corner. Each chair felt heavier today, or perhaps her arms were simply tired from another night spent staring at the budget reports in her dim apartment. She smoothed the rug with the toe of her sensible shoe. At 1300 hours, the children would arrive. They were Dobrovolniv clad, a voluntary contribution to the future, as she often told the disinterested board members. Unlike the obязательный платеж of school, the library was where they chose to be. The peace shattered when the front doors swung open with a violence that didn't belong in this hall. 3 men in charcoal suits, led by a man named Robert Griffin from the city's administrative oversight, marched toward her. Their footsteps on the parquet were like gunshots. Marjorie stood her ground behind the desk, her spine a rigid line of defiance. "Mrs. Quinn," Griffin said, his voice flat, drained of any humanity. He didn't look at the books. He looked at the clipboard in his hand. "We're here to discuss the fiscal realignment, effective immediately." Marjorie felt a cold needle of dread prick her chest. The children's literacy program starts in 3 hours, Mr. Griffin. We have a budget for the quarter. The budget has been optimized, Griffin replied. He handed her a sheet of paper. The numbers were a slaughter. Every outreach program, every after-school sanctuary, every penny for new acquisitions, gone. Excised like a tumor. The city is in a deficit. We're closing the social wings of all branch libraries. You're to focus on basic maintenance and archival storage. You're killing the heart of this neighborhood, Marjorie whispered, her voice rasping like a pen on dry parchment. These children have nowhere else. This isn't just a line item, it's a moral obligation. Griffin didn't blink. It's a math problem, Mrs. Quinn, and the math says you're over-leveraged. As they turned to leave, Marjorie felt the walls of her sanctuary closing in. She needed someone who understood the weight of these decisions beyond the ink. She reached for the telephone, her fingers trembling as she dialed a number she knew by heart. David Hansen, her protege. The boy she had mentored when he was a clerk, the man she had helped elevate to the district administration. David would fix this. He was the one who had promised that the library's legacy was safe. The journey to the district administration building felt like a fever dream. The streets of Philadelphia were gray and indifferent, the wind whipping through Marjorie's thin cardigan. She entered the glass and steel tower, a jarring contrast to her world of wood and paper. David's office was on the 12th floor, a temple of modern power with panoramic views of the city he was currently dismantling. David rose from his leather chair, a smooth smile pinned to his face. He looked like he was made of plastic that had been slightly melted and then polished. "Marjorie," he said, his voice like silk over gravel. "I heard about the cuts. I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't fund the literacy program, David," she said, refusing to sit. She stood in the center of the room, her gray cardigan smelling of dust and desperation. "You told me the grant was secure. The $3 million federal education grant. Where is it?" David adjusted his cuffs, a tell Marjorie remembered from 20 years ago. "The city's general fund is a complex ecosystem, Marjorie. Money has to flow where the need is most acute. Infrastructure, public safety. The library is a luxury in a time of crisis." "A luxury?" Marjorie's voice rose, turning sharp. "Books are an asset that doesn't depreciate. You're talking about these children as if they're non-liquid assets to be written off. My sister died because people like you decided her life was a deficit." David's eyes turned cold, the glass-like surface of his gaze hardening. "Marjorie, you're tired. You're seeing ghosts. Go home. Retire with dignity before you make a scene you can't take back." She left his office feeling smaller than she ever had. But beneath the fear, a spark of suspicion began to itch. David was lying. She knew the rhythm of his lies. Back at the library, the sun had set, leaving the aisles in a deep, melancholy shadow. She retreated to the archive in the basement, a cramped room that smelled of damp and cooling metal. The yellow fluorescent lights hummed with a low, anxious vibration. She sat at the old computer, her fingers hovering over the keys. She had the administrator codes. Codes David had forgotten she still possessed. She began to dig. The internal network was a labyrinth, but she was a librarian. She knew how to find what was hidden. Suddenly, the cursor on her screen moved. Marjorie froze. She wasn't touching the mouse. The arrow darted across the desktop, opening folders, dragging files into the trash. Someone was inside the system. Someone was remote wiping the financial archives. "No," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She lunged for the printer power button. She couldn't stop the deletion, but she could save the evidence. She navigated to the Grant Allocation folder, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. The screen flickered. A command prompt window opened, lines of code cascading down like a digital waterfall, erasing the history of the library's theft. She hit print just as the first folder vanished. The printer groaned, its internal gears screaming as it warmed up. On the monitor, the general ledger disappeared. Then, vendor payments. "Come on," she hissed, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the metal desk. The printer began to hum. The first sheet slid out, warm and smelling of ozone. She grabbed it, the paper hot against her palms. More sheets followed, a frantic staccato of mechanical birth. On the screen, a blue box appeared. Critical system error. Access denied. The monitor went black. The hum of the computer fan died with a long, mournful whistle. The room fell into a terrifying silence, broken only by the last sheet of paper sliding into the tray. Marjorie gathered the warm stack, clutching it to her chest as if it were a child. She looked at the top page. Grant Construction. The name meant nothing to her, but the numbers next to it did. Millions of dollars, transferred in increments of 50,000, all authorized by a digital signature she recognized instantly. David's signature. She didn't stay to turn off the lights. She shoved the papers under her coat, the edges biting into her skin through her blouse. The heavy oak doors of the library slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the empty street. She walked fast, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the pavement. Every shadow between the street lamps seemed to stretch toward her. A black sedan sat idling at the corner, its headlights dim. Marjorie didn't look back. She turned into an alley, her breath coming in ragged plumes of white in the cold night air. When she reached her apartment, she locked all 3 deadbolts and leaned against the door, gasping. The silence of her home felt violated. She went to the kitchen and spread the papers across the worn floral tablecloth. She took a yellow highlighter from her bag and began to work. The neon yellow ink slashed across the pages. Grant Stroy. Grant Stroy. Grant Stroy. The dates aligned perfectly with the budget shortfalls David had cited. The money meant for Sam's reading books and Lily's afternoon snacks had been diverted to a shell company. She found the final proof at the bottom of the 3rd page. A direct transfer for illustrated history volumes, the exact amount of the elementary school grant, deposited into an account linked to a private developer. David hadn't just moved the money. He'd stolen the children's future to pave a parking lot or build a luxury condo. The realization made her nauseous. She looked at her hands. They were stained with yellow ink and gray toner. She needed to confront him, not as a subordinate, but as the woman who had taught him how to read a balance sheet. The next morning, she met him in the park. It was a neutral ground, or so she thought. The wind whistled through the empty playground, making the rusted swings scream. David was waiting by the fountain, his coat perfectly tailored, his expression a mask of bored concern. "I found them, David," she said, pulling the folded report from her pocket. "Grant Stroy, I know where the grant went." David didn't reach for the papers. He didn't even look at them. His face shifted, the mask of the protege falling away to reveal a man with a heart of reinforced concrete. A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. "You should have stayed in the basement, Marjorie," he said. His voice was a low crawl, cold and lethal. "You think these papers matter? I control the board, I control the audit. You're an old woman who can't remember where she put her glasses half the time. I remember the law, David. I remember what honesty looks like." He stepped into her space, the scent of his expensive cologne clashing with the smell of wet leaves. Do you? Because I've already filed the preliminary report on the irregularities in your branch. Embezzlement is a heavy charge for someone your age. Think about your pension. Think about the headlines. Beloved librarian steals from children. Who will they believe? The rising star of the administration or the woman with early onset dementia? Marjorie felt the air leave her lungs. I don't have. You will by the time the doctors I hire are through with you, he whispered. Burn the papers, Marjorie. Go home. Fade away. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the gravel. She felt the world tilting. When she finally made it back to her apartment, she saw the door was ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, white jagged teeth of pine showing through the brown paint. She pushed it open. The apartment had been gutted. Her books, the collection of a lifetime, had been ripped from the shelves, their spines broken, pages scattered like fallen snow. The kitchen was covered in a fine layer of white flour. Her tea tins had been emptied, her chairs upended. They hadn't found the papers. She had kept them in her coat, the one still wrapped around her shivering frame. But the message was clear. There was no sanctuary. She moved to the window and pulled back the lace curtain. Down on the street, the black sedan was back. It sat under the skeletal branches of a maple tree. The driver's side window cracked just enough to show the orange glow of a cigarette. They were waiting. Marjorie retreated to the bathroom, the only room with no windows. She slid the brass bolt shut and sat on the edge of the tub, the cold porcelain numbing her legs. In the small, tiled space, her own breathing sounded like a gale. She was alone. The city was against her. David was the hunter, and she was the prey. But as she looked at the reflection of her tired, lined face in the cracked mirror, she didn't see a victim. She saw the girl who had survived her sister's death. She saw the woman who had protected the books for 30 years. The day of the board of directors meeting arrived like a funeral. Marjorie tried to enter the City Hall annex, but her plastic ID card failed. The reader emitted a harsh, red screech. Access denied. The security guard, a man she'd shared coffee with for years, looked away as he called for backup on his radio. She was a ghost in her own city. She bought a copy of the Philadelphia Times at a kiosk. Her face stared back at her under a headline about financial discrepancies at local library. David had moved fast. The poison was already in the well. She saw her colleagues standing near the service entrance, a group of them huddling in a cloud of cigarette smoke. When she approached, the conversation died. Mr. Green, who had worked beside her for a decade, suddenly found the brickwork of the building fascinating. Miss Evans crushed her cigarette and vanished inside. The betrayal was a physical weight, a stone in her stomach. But Marjorie Quinn didn't turn back. She knew the layout of the building. She knew the service corridors that the suits never used. She slipped through a delivery entrance behind a catering van, the smell of roasted coffee and floor bleach masking her presence. She moved through the labyrinth of the basement, her heart a frantic bird in a cage, until she reached the back of the auditorium. She hid behind a heavy velvet curtain. On stage, David was at the lectern. He looked magnificent. He spoke of fiscal responsibility and heartbreaking choices. He spoke of the unfortunate instability of certain long-term staff members. Marjorie waited. She waited until the room was thick with the manufactured grief of the board members. Then she stepped out. The double doors at the back of the hall banged open as she marched down the center aisle. The sound was a thunderclap. Every head turned. David froze, his hand halfway to his glasses. "The instability isn't in the staff, David," Marjorie shouted, her voice echoing off the marble. It's in the ledger. She reached the front of the room, her sensible shoes clicking a death march on the carpet. She held the papers high. David recovered instantly. He grabbed the microphone, the feedback whining like a wounded animal. "Mrs. Quinn, please. We've discussed your health. Security, please assist the lady. She's confused." "I am not confused," Marjorie screamed. But the board members were already shaking their heads with pity. David pulled a document from his own folder. "This is a medical evaluation from the city's health liaison," he lied, holding up a paper with a forged seal. "Marjorie is suffering from a severe cognitive break. She's been hallucinating these thefts for weeks." The room gasped. The pity turned to a cold, clinical distance. Marjorie felt the heavy hands of the guards on her shoulders. They were lifting her, dragging her toward the exit. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the parents, the neighbors. They were looking at her as if she were a broken machine. Then she saw her. In the very back row, Lily, a 7-year-old who came to the library every Tuesday for the literacy hour, was crying. She was clutching a tattered book of fairy tales Marjorie had mended herself. The girl's eyes were wide with a terror that only a child can feel when the world stops making sense. Marjorie stopped struggling. She went limp in the guards' arms, catching them off guard. She took a deep breath, the cold air of the hall filling her lungs. "You want to talk about math, David?" She projected, her voice no longer a scream, but the steady, iron-hard tone of a woman who had spent 30 years demanding silence in the face of chaos. "Let's talk about the $12,400 for history books that never arrived. Let's talk about the $6,000 for the lunch program that went to a parking lot on 3rd Avenue. She began to recite the numbers, not as a plea, but as an indictment. She called out the dates, the account numbers, the names of the shell companies. The guards hesitated. The crowd began to murmur. "Grand Stroy," Marjorie yelled. "Check the records for June. Check the signature on the wire transfer." She pointed a bony, accusing finger at David. His face was no longer smooth. It was a mask of sweating, panicked meat. He lunged for the microphone, trying to drown her out. But he tripped over the cord. The heavy oak lectern toppled with a sickening crash. In the chaos, Lily ran forward. She picked up one of the pages Marjorie had dropped, a page with a bright blue city seal and David's looping, arrogant signature. The girl didn't know what it meant, but she knew Marjorie. She ran to a woman in the front row, a reporter Marjorie had tipped off the night before. The hall erupted. The cameras of the local news crews, hidden until now, flickered to life. The white light of the Safidi blinded David as he scrambled on the floor, trying to gather the scattered evidence. The board members were fleeing like rats, their briefcases held over their faces. But the police were already at the doors. 2 officers moved through the crowd, their brass badges glinting. They didn't go for Marjorie. They went for the man on the floor. Marjorie watched as the handcuffs ratcheted shut around David's wrists. He looked up at her, his eyes full of a pathetic, desperate hatred. She didn't feel triumph. She felt a profound, aching sadness for the boy he had once been. A week later, Marjorie sat in a sterile office in the City Hall annex. The air smelled of bleach and old coffee. A lawyer from the administration pushed a paper toward her. "Resignation by mutual consent," he said. "It preserves your pension. It keeps the city's reputation intact." Marjorie picked up the pen. Her hand shook, just a little. She signed her name for the last time as a city employee. She was 58, and her career was over. There would be no gold watch, no retirement party in the reading room. She went back to her branch one last time to collect her things. The office was quiet. The brass nameplate on her door had already been removed, leaving a pale, rectangular scar on the wood. She packed her chipped mug, her green-shaded lamp, and the small cactus that had somehow survived the neglect of the last week. As she walked out of the building, the heavy box in her arms, she paused on the steps. The autumn sun was low, casting long golden shadows across the street. She looked through the large front window of the reading room. Inside, the lights were on. A group of volunteers was unpacking boxes, new boxes. She could see the glossy spines of the new encyclopedias, the bright covers of the history books she had fought for. Lily was there, sitting on the faded Persian rug, her nose buried in a book about the stars. Marjorie Quinn adjusted her glasses. Her heart was heavy, but her soul was quiet. She had lost her place in the world, but the world she had protected was still standing. She turned away from the library and began to walk. The gravel of the path crunched under her sensible shoes, a steady, rhythmic sound. She didn't look back. The shadows of the trees stretched out before her, marking the way into a long, uncertain future. But for the first time in years, the budget was balanced. The debt was paid. She walked into the evening, a woman who had saved the books, and in doing so, had finally saved herself.